Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin with the last part of the, or almost last part of the program, that is the roundtable discussion in which we would like to discuss the future of using the past in international relations. We will have three distinguished panelists here in the library and two online. I hope they are already there. We have two moderators, and what we are going to do is we will have 2 rounds of questions. Each of the panelists will have 5 minutes for answering them, and then we will open the discussion to the public. So let me start by introducing Professor Marek Kornat, who is a historian, graduate, and doctor of the renowned university, the renowned Jagiellonian University in Krakow, and professor of humanities. He works at the Institute of History of the Polish Academy of Sciences and teaches at the Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński University in Warsaw. He mainly deals with the history of Polish diplomacy and international relations in the 19th and 20th centuries, as well as with issues of the Second Polish Republic. He also devotes a lot of attention to the history of Polish political thought, the historiography of totalitarian systems, as well as the genesis of and importance of Sovietology. He published, among others, a few very good monographs like Poland 1939 in the face of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, or the Polish Sovietological School 1930-39, etc. There are a number of publications. Łukasz Kamiński he has already spoken today, but nevertheless I would like to introduce him. He is graduate of the Historical Institute of the University of Wroclaw. He has been assistant professor there since 1999. From 2006, he was deputy director of the Public Education Office of the Institute of the National Remembrance, and then since 2011, he was elected president of the Institute of National Remembrance. And he was the president until 2016. His research interests encompass the issues of opposition and social resistance to the communist regime. He is the author of monographs such as Workers' Strikes in Poland 1945-48 or Poles in the Face of the New Reality 44-48. He is co-editor of the pioneering collective monograph of the communist apparatus of the repression in the countries of the Soviet bloc, and German Handbuch der kommunistischen Geheimdienste in Osteuropa, 440 until 91. And now he is director of the institute, the Ossoliński Institute in Wroclaw.
Thank you, Bartosz. It's my pleasure to introduce our 3 other speakers. Let me start with Jie-Hyun Lim, who is a South Korean historian, writer, and memory activist who's conceptualized paradigms of mass dictatorship and victimhood nationalism. He is a professor of transnational history and the director of Critical Global Studies Institute at Sogang University in Seoul. Since Lim founded the Research Institute of Comparative History and Culture in 2004, he has carried out a series of international projects, including the East Asian History Forum for Criticism and Solidarity and the Flying University of Transnational Humanities, which sounds quite fun. Lately, Lim has been delving into the field of transnational history and memory, and he has written and edited around 24 books, the latest of which is, I believe, Mnemonic Solidarity, Global Interventions from 2021, unless there's been an even more recent release, which I wouldn't put past him. We're also joined online by Maria Mälksoo, who is a senior researcher at the Center for Military Studies at the Department of Political Science of the University of Copenhagen. Maria received her PhD in International Studies from the University of Cambridge in 2008 and had previously worked at the University of Kent, Brussels School of International Studies, and the University of Tartu in Estonia. Her primary fields of research are critical security studies, ontological security, the securitization of historical memory, hybrid warfare, political anthropology, and social studies of deterrence. She's the author of The Politics of Becoming European, released with Routledge in 2010, and a co-author of Remembering Kathrin, released with Polity in 2012. Her most recent articles have appeared in all of the top journals, the European Journal of International Relations, the Review of International Studies, and a whole host of other interesting and important and influential journals. She's currently editing the Handbook on the Politics of Memory and leading the University of Copenhagen team in the Volkswagen Foundation-supported project, The Challenge of Populist Memory Politics of Europe Towards Effective Responses to Militant Legislation on the Past, or Memocracy. And then last but not least, of course, we have Kathrin Bachleitner, who received her MPhil in International Relations and Economics from the School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University over in the US, and a Doctor of Philosophy in International Relations from the University of Oxford in the UK. Kathrin is an IKEA Foundation Research Fellow in International Relations at LMA, Lady Margaret Hall, and Oxford's Department of International Development in the Refugee Studies Centre. Previously, she had worked for the Foreign Ministry in Vienna, developmental agencies in the Palestinian territories, and her background is in international relations and political science, while her academic interests concern collective identity, memory, and values in international relations, with a regional focus on Europe and the Middle East. Thank you to all of our speakers for joining us here today.
Okay, and the person who was speaking now was Jade McGlynn, who is senior researcher at the Monterey Initiative in Russian Studies, where she is also the co-director of the Monterey Summer Symposium on Russia and director of the Monterey Trialogue Initiative. And I'm deputy head of the academic department at the ENRS. So let's start with the first round. The first question will go to Marek Kornat. So the interwar period is still a very important point of reference for the Poles and for other nations, as we have seen during the centenary of the end of the First World War. And maybe even the relevance is growing because we can now compare the current situation in Europe with the situation in the interwar period. So I would like to ask you, how was history used or misused within foreign relations back then in the interwar period?
Thank you very much for the invitation. Good evening. How much time I have? Oh, 5 minutes only. It will be very important to self-limit in such a short time. First of all, I will say that I have generally 4 remarks only. Let me say that the importance of the interwar era in the historical thought of today, and especially in the politics of memory, is still very visible. And this is the period of significant importance in influencing our dealing with the past of Europe in 20th century. Why is it so? First of all, we must remember that this rather short period, 20 years, because we have only 20 years between the Versailles Treaty, Paris Peace Conference, etc., and the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact and the invasion of Poland, only 20 years. But in this time, we have, first of all, the general international crisis of the old Europe, of the old world, and this is the period of transition between the First World War and the Second World War, and it is named in historiography as a European Civil War. European Civil War, Europejska wojna domowa in Polish. Secondly, in this time we have a special problem of the growth of two totalitarian regimes in the countries neighboring with Poland. I mean, Soviet Russia, Soviet Union was the first totalitarian regime in the world. And secondly, it must be not neglected the situation in Germany, especially, I mean, the Third Reich regime of Hitler, of course. And this is a problem of the genesis of the beginning of the Second World War, the responsibility for the war, and that's all. We have a problem of special importance in dealing with this time. And last but not least, we must not to neglect one thing which is of special importance for us in Poland, especially. For Europe in general, the First World War, the Great War, was the catastrophic event. It led to the collapse of the world role of Europe, etc. But for such nations as we, the Poles, it brought a chance for independence, for the new state, for the new way of life, for the new international order. Polish Sovietologist Professor Sukiennicki named this great change, saying that it was a geopolitical revolution in Europe, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. And that's why I think we have many serious reasons of the special importance of the interwar era for us. I tried to say only on the major of them. Secondly, I would like to say that in the politics of memory, we have the lack of balance, the lack of equilibrium between the treatment with the Soviet totalitarianism and the other totalitarianism, German or Italian fascist dictatorship. The Soviet Union is in historiography, and not only in historiography, in public discourse, of course, is presented as a special kind of authoritarianism. Sometimes the term of the notion of totalitarianism is neglected. It is a problem for us in the comprehension of the international situation, and also with the researching of the realities in the interwar era. The lack of the equilibrium in the treatment of two totalitarian regimes. This is my second remark. And the remark number three, I would like to say that for our point of view of today, we must remember on Russia. We must remember on Russia not only as a country which started the war last February, but Russia's public discourse dealing with history is still present in the world, and it is a significant factor for the discussion on the interwar era. This is totally against the idea of this positive change in the European situation after the First World War. From Russia's point of view, the Versailles Order is absolutely should be condemned. This is the first point of Russian discourse in our time. And it is the second problem, the next problem, so to say, in the discussion about the interwar era in historical, not only in the past, which can be researched, but also in the public discourse on this time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. These are definitely reasons why we should be remembering the interwar period right now. Now, in my paper, I was trying to address the various roles that history can have in international relations. One of them was the role of history as a platform for dialogue. And therefore, I would like to ask Łukasz Kamiński, can history be also used in a positive way as some sort of for reconciliation? Could you give us maybe some examples, if you agree with it?
Yeah, of course, during such conferences like ours today, we are usually focusing on conflicts of memory, various tensions, various aspects of misusing history, but we should remember that there is also this another positive side, because history in this context is just a tool, and you can use it for good or bad purposes. It's our choice. And of course, as you suggest, reconciliation processes of various kinds. We can use Polish-German reconciliation or French-German reconciliation, many others, also internal ones, are maybe even obvious example of this good use of past. But it's not only about being obvious, but also it's very important example. Because, for example, if you are speaking about the Polish-German reconciliation process, we are speaking about using the same past, which can be source of deep division and sometimes is misused to deepen the division between the nations for good purposes, to heal the wounds of the past. So this is one example. Another one can be found in various places in the world when we start discussion, especially with the young people, from learning from history. I don't know, Auschwitz, for example. Yeah, there is a center for dialogue, but there are dozens such places only in Europe. Yeah? When we are using the past to start debate with the people of various nationalities, about the current situation, about our task, our obligations towards the current situation, etc., etc. So it's another way how to use an example, and maybe we can extend it also. Maybe it's not about the international relations, but we should remember about education. Yeah, we are using in education to promote some values connected usually with the people. So to return to international level, for example, a few years ago, European Parliament called to establish a day of remembrance of heroes of anti-totalitarian resistance, and according to this call, this day should be 25th of May, which is a day of execution of Witold Pilecki, yeah, who is an example of the group of people who fought against both totalitarian regimes. And it's not only about the remembrance, it's also about promoting certain values connected with such a people. And the same aspects appears in bilateral relations. For example, for me and other people who were involved in establishing better relations between Poles and Czechs, maybe it's not so obvious example. Yeah. Ryszard Siwiec was a very important and is a very important person, and we did a lot to promote his deeds and thoughts. So Ryszard Siwiec, who committed self-immolation to protest against the 1968 invasion in Czechoslovakia. Yeah? So it's another example. We use this past for good sake of better relations or better knowledge of our nations, etc. And maybe the very fresh example. So during the last year migration crisis, and also during many discussions in Poland connected with the refugees from Ukraine, we are also returning to the history in a good sense. Yes, we are speaking about about Polish experience of being exiled, of the support for Poles in the 1980s, for example, from many countries in Europe, especially from Germany. And this historical example was used in a good purpose to make people more emphatic, more open for refugees, for migrants. So those are just a few examples. So it's our choice. Are we going to use the past for good or rather not?
Thank you, Łukasz. Jie-Hyun, if I could turn to you now and ask, as you are a meticulous observer of European politics of memory from an East Asian perspective, what would you say are the biggest differences between these two regions' views and approach to memory?
It's very, very difficult question to be answered in one sentence. But actually differences and similarities are intermingled in a sense. I mean, that the big difference is that in East Asia, we have lots of EPN on different levels, but we don't have ENRS. Where does it come from? Because I think that you have a European Union frame, but in East Asia, we have only nation-state frame. So although the memory studies organizations or sort of academic institutions are organized on the nation-state basis, so it is very difficult to make a certain transnational memory studies or it's such an ENRS workshop. This is very important because all the foundation is national. They only fund the national studies. For example, I was at the outside review of European Science Foundation in the first decade of this century, and all the proposals to the ESF was about transnational history project. In a sense, European Union promotes that sort of approach, but in East Asia, all the systems are based on the nation-state level, so it's very difficult to really promote transnational things. Only on a very private level we can do it, but it's also very, very limited. So institutionally, the most big difference is between this existence of European Union as a frame or as an umbrella organization, but we have still very conflicting nation states and in the memories and history. But it never means that the East Asian memory studies was outside the global memory formation. We are very much, East Asian memory studies are under the umbrella of global memory space or global memory formation. For example, you know, the first Hiroshima Auschwitz Ossoliński peace march was organized in 1962. So Japanese peace activists, anti-nuclear peace activists, they came to the Krakow, Auschwitz Ossoliński and they take part in the day of liberation of Auschwitz, January 27 of 1963. But it never means also it is a very much global history, global memory oriented one, because the guy who was standing behind this organization was Jan Frankowski. He was a member of PAX, right? So this sort of a Cold War politics stood behind this PZPR, Polish Communist Party, through the PAX guy, tried to invite Japanese anti-nuclear peace activists from Hiroshima to Auschwitz, because it shows that how the American imperialists threatens world peace by using nuclear weapons. So this sort of Cold War politics also has worked out in the East Asian and East European entangled memories in 1963. But you know how many Holocaust courses were taught in the United States in 1963? Whole United States, just one course. So compared to this situation, I think this peace march from Hiroshima to Auschwitz has its own meaning, despite, regardless of it has a certain mobilized by the Cold War politics from the different parts of the world. But on the other hand, also this in Japan, for example, Viktor Frankl's book was translated already in 1950s. And in the Japanese translation, the translator's preface to the Japanese translation of Viktor Frankl, the apparent he wrote that we need this sort of approach to the Second World War, and just by pointing out the Nanjing massacre in the 1956 or 7. But after that, also on the other hand, Anne Frank diary was the bestseller in Japan. It's more than 4 million copies were sold after the Second World War. So Japan is the first country where the Anne Frank diary was the bestseller even before Germany or Netherlands. But on the other hand, also Japanese public, in a sense, tends to appropriate Anne Frank's diary in order to show that, oh, those Jews, like as Japanese, was the biggest victims by the white racism. So the atomic bomb victims and the Holocaust victims, they are arch victims by white racists. So in that sense, the Japanese nationalist memory also try to appropriate global memory formation on their own. So that tension has been always dominant. But this tension was different from the East European one, because European one tension, as you said, the memory tension between the memory of Soviet Union's communist rule and the Nazism, right? That tension we can find between this Prague Declaration and the 70th years declaration after the Wannsee Conference. But in East Asian case, the different tension, the tension between a certain universal or Holocaust or genocide one and colonial tension. So still, colonial factor has been always one of the dominant factors in determining or in explaining Munamoscape in East Asia since the end of the Second World War. Okay, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Fascinating answer. Let me now turn to Kathrin, who is joining us online. I'm not quite sure where to look. There's about four Kathrins. There we are. I'll just look. I won't look at you at all, Kathrin. So are the ministries, in your opinion, are the ministries of foreign relations worldwide, or you could focus on just a few, aware of the importance of history and memory for international relations?
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, the area of foreign policy has clearly moved out of the ivory towers of ministries and into the watchful eye of a global public and media, right? And diplomacy as well has become public and digitalized, if you want. And there are ever more ways for people to participate in it. And of course, such an informed global public is asking critical questions of country representatives, also about their national histories and memories. And then, of course, diplomats, once they enter the international stage, find history and memory everywhere. As foreign relations are deepening and widening, memories get unearthed, right? So one must only think of the resurfacing of Europe's colonial legacy as the EU's Foreign Action Service is expanding its relations with Middle Eastern and African countries. So I think through foreign relations, the circles are expanding, and thus new perspectives on national histories are opening up. Yeah? What at home is a patriotic national narrative might have, different resonance and political expediency outside of that country. Yeah? It will likely look very different from an outside perspective. And perhaps then, it will clash with the interpretation of others. And I think, diplomacy, after all, is the act of finding common ground. And for this to be successful, any common ground must also include countries' histories and their memories. So yes, I cannot picture diplomatic relations without taking history and memory into account.
Thank you very much, Kathrin. The next, let me follow on with, to be honest with you, a reasonably similar question, but with a twist for Maria. So if we think about defense, our historical narratives and memory, would you describe them as inscribed in the security policies of the ministries of defense? To what extent yes, to what extent no, and do you think they should be?
Thank you, Jade, and thanks also for accommodating us online. I have very fond memories from the Genealogies of Memories conference from 10 years ago, exactly 10 years ago. So I regret I could not be there in person today. But yes, the short answer is yes, because historical narratives certainly underpin state stories of the origins of their moments of celebrations and humiliations, and they, of course, thereby also inform state security policies, but they do so in some cases more explicitly than in others, obviously. History and memory generally are, of course, very powerful social resources, and since they have that emotive mobilizational power, they are also very attractive to policymakers of all sorts, because they are prone to be instrumentalized, institutionalized, and also securitized, or even outright weaponized. But I'd say still that the formulation of state security policy, obviously, is not just the prerogative of the Ministry of Defense. And thereby also, when we talk about the sort of broader state's usage or struggles over memory, then we are really talking about these strategic contestations over the capacity to mobilize various mnemonic resources, narratives, but also people and networks. So it is a struggle over, who gets to control the means of symbolic presentation and representation, and who gets also to somehow undermine the opponents or antagonists' narrative. So I'd say that ministries of defense are certainly one side, but only one side of institutionalized state power, which would act as guardians of the chosen state story, if we use Jennifer Dixon's turn of phrase here. I would say that when we look into our region, into the region of Central and Eastern Europe, then MODs have not been really at the forefront of securitizing and weaponizing of historical memory. If we compare that to the top leadership and ministries of justice and ministries of foreign affairs, for example, or perhaps even more broadly, the representatives of what Louis Althusser called the ideological state apparatuses, right? We have these various state-launched institutes of historical memory in the region. But I think it is, when we look at the claims about memory being something that must be defended politically, and then we actually see how states that are anxious about their identities and respective positions in the global mnemonical hierarchies, they tend to think of the problem more comprehensive. It's not just the prerogative of the ministries of defense. But that being said, of course, these lessons of the past are a standard feature of security political reasoning and framing of the respective strategies, formulation of the respective strategies at home and projecting them abroad in the world. And I think what we see, in the case of this current instrumentalization, twisting of historical tropes by the Putin regime in Russia is, of course, also an instance of how the insecurity of memory and by extension of particular state identity, and then the state's physical conduct, behavior in the world political arena are actually clearly intertwined. So we have been witnessing how this kinetic war that Russia is waging against Ukraine has been also preceded by and very much run in parallel to a memory war. And of course, part and parcel of this playing ground has been the legal domain of somehow fixing a certain story and undermining or criminalizing the other story. So we've also seen in the Russian case the actual constitutionalization of a particular mnemonical narrative. So we witness how the very historically charged tropes of genocide and Nazism have been, or what Putin calls the real lessons of the Second World War, have been put into the use of something that is very present in a very instrumentalized way. I mean, one recalls the character of Humpty Dumpty from Lewis Carroll's Alice in the Looking Glass Land, where, basically we see how the word is chosen to mean whatever Putin / Humpty Dumpty chooses it to me, right? So we have, you know, denazification, decommunization happening in the same breath, whilst both tropes are actually emptied of their historical meaning. So I'd say, indeed, that we should pay attention to the whole constellations of foreign and security political actors and not obviously just delimit our attention to MODs in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. The next question goes to Jie-Hyun again. So how have the East Asian politics of history or memory influenced the world of IR?
Also very difficult question. But just as a joke, I can say that most contribution from East Asia to the memory politics in the world came from North Korea. I mean that North Korean guys, they won the competition to build a monument of national liberation in African countries. So they built more than 50 monuments of national liberation fighters in Africa. But the problem is that their faces look like a little bit Asians. So, because they are very much experienced in building up the huge statues of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il in North Korea, and also very cheaply they could build this. They won almost all the competition in African countries. So that's the most visible contribution to the memory politics in the world from the East Asian corner. But the software, I mean that in the year 2019, I organized the Flying University of Transnational Humanities under the title of Holocaust Meets the Post-Colonial. So Dr. Moses came to us to give his keynote speech, and also, I mean, it's before the Mbembe controversy in Germany, I organized this sort of how to combine the memory of Holocaust to a memory of colonialism. But also in Eastern Europe, you try to make this memory of Stalinism and memory of Holocaust bump. But in our contribution is that we should add the colonial dimension to this memory contest in Eastern Europe between Holocaust memories and the Stalinist memory. The problem is that still, I don't deny the Holocaust as a template. It's a memory template. But for me, the Holocaust, the reason why Holocaust remains a memory template for me is not Holocaust per se, but the Holocaust studies. Really excellent scholars had worked on Holocaust, so lots of accumulated really good studies. I could get lots of references to understanding the memories of colonialism in East Asia or in different parts of the world. So in that sense, I think that still Holocaust can work as a very important memory template. But on the other hand, when I make this Holocaust memory bump into the memory of colonial genocide in different parts of the world, I raised the question of critical relativization of Holocaust. I mean, in the historical strike in the 1986-87, relativization was used by these conservatives like Ernst Nolte. But in recent German debates on the Holocaust, and then we can find that it is rather conservatives who are stuck to the criticism of relativization. So, but in order to differentiate between Ernst Nolte's relativization, I proposed the concept of critical relativization in my article to Journal of Genocide Research. Actually, how have these memories of Holocaust and Stalinist terror and colonial genocide met in the global memory space? And how this sort of very tensioned or tense entanglement of different memories give us a certain new breakthrough, which is neither prison of the Holocaust uniqueness, nor to, how can I say, to justify certain very delicate justification of Holocausts by using different parts of the world. But this is, yes, still very, very difficult question. But I think that this, by combining or by making entangled these different memories in the world, we can, I think, then make a contribution to our understanding or to our memory culture in the more better direction, not only from the East Asian part, but also Eastern Europe and so-called Western Europe together.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, I believe since his time in the Institute of National Remembrance, Łukasz Kamiński has been interested in disinformation issues. He has also conducted a project with us, with the ENRS, devoted to disinformation in memory politics. So I would like to ask you, how can we counteract disinformation in this sphere in memory politics, also from at the international level?
Thank you. I think we have four main things to do. Probably there are more, but I will focus on those four most important ones. And the first of them is we shouldn't escape from the past. We shouldn't avoid debates on even most difficult for us from various point of view moments of history. We shouldn't abandon some fragments of the past, and it is important because effective disinformation is not based on lie. It is based on the true facts, but manipulated ones. And if we are not dealing with some parts of our history, we are leaving a space for disinformation, for misusing this history. The second thing is we should monitor disinformation. Unfortunately, for example, in Europe, European Union has quite effective mechanism of monitoring disinformation called EU versus Disinfo, and we are not only monitoring but also debunking the disinformation. But the problem is that they are focusing very much on politics, economics, not on the history. Less than 1% of those analyses of examples of Russian mainly disinformation are connected with the history. So we need to build a mechanism to monitor and to analyze and take conclusions for our fight against disinformation. Without the knowledge about the not only mechanism, because I think we quite well know the general mechanism, but it's necessary also to know the specific mechanism or single disinformation. Without this knowledge, we will be quite weak in this counteracting to disinformation. The third advice is to educate. And of course, I do not mean to educate about history. Of course, I'm a historian, I'm in favor of historical education, but we cannot educate everyone about everything regarding history. So we cannot prepare people to know facts about every possible disinformation in the field of memory or field of history. But we should educate how to deal with disinformation, how to understand disinformation. And in my opinion, there are two basic skills which are very useful for this. And those skills are represented by journalists and by historians. So teaching, for example, so basic rules of verification of the information is crucial for combating disinformation. And the last recommendation I would say is to be engaged. My quite fresh experience is connected with a very small research I did last 2 years with my students. We checked the profiles of many Polish historians in social media, Facebook and Twitter, and we did just a simple analysis what is published on those profiles. So at least Polish historians, first of all, are engaged in the current political conflict. So we are discussing very actively, but current issues. They are publishing about the history, but mainly promoting own or colleagues' publications, conferences, etc. So social media are used to share the information about the some current events, important publications, etc. On the third place, of course, there is a private life, so dogs, cats, and holidays. And the last topic is to be engaged in some disputes about history. And as we know, the social media right now are the main tool of disinformation. So if we as historians are not active in this field, we are not using not only our knowledge, but a kind of authority we have in this field to counteract, we are missing the point, and we are missing the important chance to combat or counteract disinformation.
I'm afraid you have read my profile as well. Kathrin, in your book on the role of collective memory in IR, you show that it isn't only a memory that shapes countries and their international interactions, but that the international sphere also plays an essential role in how countries approach the past. So could you please expand on it?
Yeah, right. So in my book, it's called Collective Memory in International Relations. I emphasize that there are these two sides to the politics of memory, one domestic and one international. And I myself put more emphasis on the international side to bring about a country's memory. So usually in this interdisciplinary politics of memory literature, the story is as to how a country's memory comes about is that politicians tell some kind of official story with which they can gain politically, internally, domestically. So ruling politicians will forge a story that has some kind of usable patriotic content. It thus unites, the people behind a positive self-image of their country or something alike, or brings like democratic wins if we're talking about the democracy. However, with their official narratives, politicians do not only speak to a domestic audience, right? Their countries do not find themselves in some kind of vacuum, but within an international community. And there too, they might have an audience, And so this international audience is likely to be more critical of a one-sided patriotic story. Or in some cases, victims groups outside of a country might begin to contest such nationalistic portrayals. So the international community or a regional community like the EU can provide broader incentive structures for governments to address also the more shameful aspects of their country's past. Maybe to illustrate this point, so the power of the international sphere to induce countries towards what could be called atonement for past crimes, if we wanted that, can best be illustrated with the example of West Germany, right? So why did only West Germany and not East Germany, for instance, or Austria, another Nazi perpetrator, atone for its crimes? Well, because it was internationally expedient for West German politicians to go down that road of reparations and atonement, internally in West Germany in the post-war decades. Of course, such an unpatriotic stance and the concomitant admission of collective guilt and shame was highly unpopular. But internationally, West Germany gained status among the Western world community with this atoning stance. So it was politically expedient for West Germany to face its Nazi past, however, only in the international sphere, not within a domestic audience. And by the way, the same goes for Austria, another one of World War II's perpetrators in my own home country. So for Austria's post-war politicians, an official story of victimhood under German Nazism was politically expedient internationally, and of course also domestically, like in all other countries. But it allowed for Austria for a quick removal of the occupying powers. It allowed for an avoidance of reparations to the Soviet Union or even partition. And so at the beginning of the Cold War, the US and also the Soviet Union had an interest in having a neutral, spotless Austria, placed as a buffer between the East and the West. So in a way, you can say that Austria's biggest national lie thus became also its biggest diplomatic success in the post-war history. However, again, of course, internally, such a patriotic victim narrative was extremely popular. But in the Austrian case, unlike then in the West German case, it was also accepted internationally, and that's important. And so, and just to conclude this idea and add to this, international incentives can also entice countries away from their patriotic national victim narratives later on. So take again this example of Austria. When Austria wanted to enter the European Union in the 1990s, its one-sided nationalistic story of victimhood was simply not politically expedient anymore in a united Europe. And therefore it was dropped and gave way to a belated admission of co-responsibility for the Nazi crimes. So you see from these examples that the international community in general and the EU specifically have the power to alter the political incentive structures for countries and their leaders to look not only to the positive, heroic aspects of their past, which comes naturally in a way, but also to face the darker and more shameful aspects of their national histories, which often does not come naturally and is highly unpopular internally, and therefore has to be induced within a wider international community.
Thank you, Kathrin. Now, I don't want to go too far into the time of the audience to ask questions, so I'll ask our last two speakers in replying to these questions to be as concise as possible. But the penultimate question is for Marek, and I would ask you, how can politicians ensure for the ethical conduct of memory politics in a way that makes use of academic debate and upholds freedom of research?
Thank you very much. I think that it is not an easy question, but I think that we can generally see two conditions of great importance. First of all, I think it is necessary not to abandon the victims, first of all, the victims of this cruel era as the 20th century was. Not to abandon the victims, and there is no better victims and no worse victims in my point of view. There are no relativization in such an approach. It is historical justice which must be applied to the historical discourse of the past. Secondly, I think that between historians which are representatives of many different nations which were in conflict in the past, there will be very difficult to see a possibility of common sense in dealing of the past, but the promotion of the culture of dialogue is absolutely of first importance. However, we have special experience in Poland of a dialogue which was only in political use in the second side, in function of in action of our partners, especially I mean the dialogue between Polish and Russian historians in the famous historical group for difficult questions some years ago. We produced a large book of studies dealing with the most difficult problems in Polish, Soviet and Polish-Russian history, but it doesn't influence the public discourse of Russia on Poland. It's absolutely a clear example of the dialogue, which in reality imitated the dialogue, but it was no consequence, no consequence for it. We have many arguments in Russian media of today, in which all Soviet stereotypes are in function. Anti-Polish stereotypes are in function. And this was a special experience of dialogue which was not productive. We must remember on it. And last but not least, I think that sometimes history brings us a special chance to do some rapprochement with our nation. I mean especially our Polish-Ukrainian relations, actually. Our historical past on 20th century, especially on the events of the Second World War and Ukrainian, is radically different. But now it produces a special chance of new historical discourse about it. It is premature for today to evaluate what will be done, what it could be done. But I think it is a special occasion to not to omit this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marek. And the final question from me and Bartosz goes to Maria, and it asks, what are the biggest challenges for the future when we think about the role of memory in international relations?
I'd flag three sets of questions in response to that question, or three potential research foci at the intersection of memory studies and international relations in the years to come. I mean, the first set of questions stems from this observation that international relations has long made about whether or not we can deduce state current intentions from the way it actually remembers and deals with its past crimes and human rights violations. That's the argument of Jennifer Lind in terms of, if the state shows atonement or the state leadership shows atonement, then the sort of signaling to the neighbors or the former victims would be more or less benign, and vice versa, right? When there is no atonement, then can we see aggressive intentions in the present also vis-a-vis these former victim nations and states? And I'm interested in that light, particularly in the link between militant memory politics and militant memory laws and openly belligerent international disposition of state actors in world politics. I think we should explore and pay more attention to what actually makes these memory laws politically productive, and what is the potential, particularly of such memory laws that very selectively try to freeze mnemonical narrative in the legislation. What is the potential of such memory laws to actually frame and underpin and perhaps further generate contemporary international conflicts? I think this is a very legitimate question to dig on further in the context of, Russia's sort of build-up for the case of invading Ukraine the way it has. And secondly, and relatedly, again, prompted by this very ongoing war, I think we need to also think about something very practical. How does one reintegrate Russia as effectively a state génocidaire in the international society? What are the prospects of actually our beloved liberal enterprise of transitional justice to deal with a problem of difference of Russia's scale and size? We have the authoritarian regime with no clear succession mechanism, very trigger happy about and with its many nukes, and openly rejecting liberalism. What can be actually done in order to advance decolonization of the Russian state and perhaps also societal mentality, to constructively assist post-war Russian people with unwrapping themselves from the experience of having lived in a lie for generations? And I think that's very much the question for years to come, for at least a generation of scholars and practitioners. And finally, I think there is a big question about how, in light of us witnessing this unraveling, or at least very serious contestation of the liberal international order, how does it affect the existing memory order, as it was, first somehow institutionalized post-1945, and then, of course, has become destabilized with, what we can broadly call the decolonization of Central and Eastern Europe post-Cold War. But, how are international orders embedded in particular memory orders, and what are then the consequences of these struggles for world reordering that we are currently witnessing on Russia's part and perhaps also on China's part for the existing normative contents and hierarchies of what we call global memories of the key events of the 20th century past, for instance. And I think in that light particularly, there is this problem of, when we talk about the liberal memory and the liberal memory order, no matter how also contested the very term itself is, but there is the question about what are the limits of toleration transnationally and at the international systemic level of increasingly illiberal memory politics springing up in various states, and not least in Central and Eastern Europe. And when we talk about illiberal memory politics, we are effectively talking about the sort of re-nationalization trend and re-centralization of historical research, restrictions on education freedom, advancement of patriotic history, and all sorts of censoring attempts of contesting mnemonical narratives and practices, up until the criminalization of undesirable perspectives on the past. So I think there is this principal issue for the international community, or its liberal component, if you will, about how can this liberal mnemonic order be defended whilst not becoming the dragon oneself, whilst fighting against the dragons of illiberalism. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Maria, and thank you to all of our speakers for answering the questions concisely and in a very fascinating way. Bartosz, I'll hand back over to you to ask some of the questions from the Zoom. Do we? Okay. Sorry, I thought I could see questions outside of in the sort of peripheral gaze. Okay, in that case, let's go to questions from the audience. I think it makes sense? Let's see. Who would like to start? Does anybody have a question for our speakers? Yes. Sorry. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Hello. I was wondering if there were points of interface between academics, policymakers, and the public that you can, looking forward as the next steps and better understanding and delving deeper into memory politics as a newbie, where those intersections might be, and that's one question. The other question relates with the last respondent. What if people don't want to talk about these things anymore? Like with the gulags, with slavery, with the colonial past, with the Holocaust, if there is that effort to forget that, whether or not it's well-intentioned or not, has there been discussion on whether or not countries nationally should be forced to discuss? Suppose Russia opts not to ever call this a war.
Thank you very much. Two very interesting questions, and I think in particular the one on intersection. I feel like Bartosz, probably we should have asked that question. It's a good question. Is there anybody who would like to jump in first, or from the speakers online? I'm very terrified of leaving the speakers online out. Maria or Kathrin, would you like to have sort of first dibs? I don't know if that's a word that's understood in international English. First response.
I'm happy to take the question on forgetting as a choice. Thank you for this, first of all. And this is, of course, the strategy that effectively has been adopted by Russia, when it comes to the bulk of its World War II legacy and the Soviet legacy, perhaps more generally. And of course, I mean, this it's easy to be of two minds there. I think you can start forgetting once you've done some reckoning, but you can't forget before you have sort of actually looked into the abyss, at least when it comes to the fact that, legally speaking, crimes against humanity are that kind of crimes that do not have a time tag on them. They are not something that can expire, so to speak. And I don't think they can also morally expire. They can only morally expire with very serious political consequences. So my argument would very much be that the very fact that due to various structural reasons, Russia has been able to get away, politically speaking, as a state, from undergoing some sort of a more systematic reckoning with its darker chapters of the 20th century past, is very much leading us to where we are now. So, I can see all sorts of flaws in transnationalizing moral remembrance calls and imperatives. But I think that when it comes to the current war, there is no way of, not just post-conflict transitional justice being somehow demanded from Russia, and I'm aware of how difficult it is, practically speaking, but also we had to speak about the broader retrospective justice when it comes to reckoning with the injustices and crimes committed in the context of the Second World War and post-1945 by Russia's predecessor state.
Thank you, Maria. Would any of our speakers like to pick up? Yes, Marek?
I have a very small remark in connection with your exchange of views. I think that we must take into account the number of victims of Stalinist regime in Russia, and it is absolutely necessary to forget about it. But for Russian people, as I understand, it is very difficult to overcome the Stalinist past because it is connected with some kind of ambivalence. From the one side, you have crimes, you have mass collectivization, you have mass terror, etc. But from the second one, it is the Second World War, it is the Great Patriotic War, it is the victory on Nazi Germany, etc. And this is the double memory in Russian historical consciousness of the Stalinist era. I think that it is very important for understand this country, actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would anybody like to pick up on the question around the intersection of policymakers and historians? And if they don't, perhaps maybe that is an answer in itself that we should. I may try. Please do.
I may try, but maybe I would focus rather on intersectional relation between policymakers and specialists in the field of memory studies, because from this point of view of our today's and not only today's debate, I think it's more important because it's not about the transfer of knowledge about the past, but rather the transfer of knowledge about the mechanism of memory, very possible usage, etc. And I think that we don't have such a transfer, especially if we think about those processes are as very fast processes, rapid changes in the situation. We don't have a monitor mechanism. I was speaking about the monitoring the disinformation, but from this point of view of current politics and international politics, for example, quite important is monitoring the conflicts of memory. And of course, we as academics, we are describing them, but you know, usually 2-3, in the best, 2-3 years after some escalation, for example. Yes, and we need a much faster transfer of knowledge, for example, to prevent escalation of such a conflict, because the policymakers usually has tools to counteract such a situation. And I think we should start the process or being closer with politicians to create a kind of objective mechanisms of transferring the information, because returning all the time to the problem of monitoring, because there are some tools used by politicians. Yes, there's global peace index, there is a global conflict risk index created under auspices of the European Union, but they do not have this historical aspect. Yeah? So from political point of view, history, the past, the memory is still not a problem, which can cause some serious situations in Europe. It's quite strange, because there are so obvious examples, and I'm not speaking about East Central Europe, all our conflicts, but for example, what about the Greece and Macedonia? Yes, they were disputing, and they are still disputing the issue of Alexander the Great, and it's a good example how many emotions you can raise using or misusing the past, how dangerous it could be. There were some other examples, riots in 2007 in Estonia, which resulted with the, in fact, first proxy war between NATO and Russia. It was the cyber attack of Russia on Estonia. So it's not only theoretical problem of some memory conflicts. It can influence our reality. And another topic is that if I'm speaking about the memory studies specialists, there is also a division and lack of contact between those who are, of course, I'm generalizing, those who are involved in many processes, like people who work in the memory institutions, and those who are just, you know, observing, analyzing, etc. So it's another issue. But the most important one is this transfer of knowledge and information from academia to politics.
And here, if I may depart from my role of moderator for a second, you were asking about the intersection of people domestically, then the power holders, the government, and then the international sphere, if I got you right. Then I would like to follow up on what you were saying and draw your attention to institutions such as museums. Here you have the work of Natalia Grincheva on museum diplomacy in the digital age. Such institutions they combine the experts, because museums used to be just institutions showing exhibitions previously, but now they have changed dramatically. They are very often right now also research institutions. So you have experts there who take part in the public discourse. A lot of people go and see these museums, their exhibitions, they publish books and so on. They are very often supported by the state or not supported, and then they influence also the international politics, because if you have museums which deal with Holocaust, for example, then they are much more than just domestic institutions. Or issues generally related to the Second World War, for example. So here you have this intersection of those different spheres, and here I think the situation is is more positive because here you have experts who are involved. So that could be one of examples. And now getting back to being moderator, are there any other questions? Okay. Two questions, yes?
Well, I just wanted to ask a quick question, which has come to mind over the course of the 3 days, but especially with this final panel. And that is the issue of regime type, which we haven't really kind of talked, which we haven't really talked about that much at all. So, for instance, it doesn't surprise me in the least that Russia is ignoring the report from the historical group for difficult questions kind of thing, right? The Chinese example that we were talking about this morning is another excellent example of an autocracy controlling kind of narratives. So, I mean, whatever we expect from memory work, right, whether it's reconciliation, whether it's transitional justice, whether it's dealing with the Russia issue, which we'll all have to deal with when this damn war is hopefully over, how do we deal with the challenge of autocracies? And also, what is the prospect for memory or the past in international affairs, given that the world is going through this process of autocratization and slippage away from open societies and liberal democracies? So how does that kind of affect a lot of what you've been talking about?
Hi, my name is Kathrin. So we discussed why states do or do not choose to reckon with the past, and usually it seems like the carrot is more effective than the stick. So my question is very similar to yours, is like, to what extent do we feel we can encourage, and to use Jade's terminology, illiberal memory exporters to reckon with the past, even with the law? And we discussed the shortcomings of international courts and kind of legislating or kind of establishing certain narratives. And I guess the glaring example in the Russia-Ukraine conflict is the use of the Nuremberg trials and the absence of any sort of discussion of Soviet crimes against humanity or crimes against peace, and how that's been weaponized or kind of used to push, again, this very narrow understanding of Soviet involvement in World War II, and also kind of absolve domestically any sort of culpability in crimes during this war. So bringing it back to the actual question is, we've also seen, in my background is both in memory but also in countering disinformation, you see actors at the UN, like Pakistan, coming in and saying, we need to have a kind of open discussion about how to moderate disinformation. Is it enough for us to focus inwards and talk about how we should be acting in good faith? How do we encourage, as Eric said, these other autocracies to engage in this sort of discussion? If we choose to look internally only and don't choose to have these open discussions, are we opening up the space for illiberal countries to set the new international norms when it comes to, you know, shaping the information space, shaping history? Thanks.
I think that these memories of good guys and memories of bad guys, then the world would be very simple. But problem is that, so I mean, that I'm really reserved about the term of autocracy, because it has an implication that bad memories are imposed by the bad guys, small band of bad guys, to the innocent majority. But reality is that, as we have a look at the Russian case, really grassroots support towards the Putin's, Putin's memories or Putin's way of interpreting the past. So I think that very often we can see the complicity between the power and the so-called innocent majority. So in the case of the Austrian case, or in our coming to terms with the past of totalitarianism or Stalinism, all the Poles were just victims by Stalinism. I think that under the BRL also some people really benefited, profited, and also some people collaborated, or certain tacit complicity or active complicity. So very multi-layered historical scenes we can find in coming to terms with the past. So in this way, the revealing complexity of the reality might be the first step. It's not just the bad guys' fault. Yes, they are really bad guys. But on the other hand, also some majority of people, if they were complicit with this, what kind of mechanisms or what kind of structures, what kind of conditions actually imposed people or persuaded people to comply with this. Because, you know, without consent from below, the dictatorship cannot be that effective because it costs too much. You know, rule the country only with just, you know, Shutazi and NKVD or KGB, it will cost too much. So without consent from below, or without making consent, or without fabricating consent from below, it was very, very difficult for the dictatorship to last for some time. So that, in the sense, memory politics really does matter. So in early 1990s, Erich Hobsbawm made a public lecture in Budapest. In his lecture, he said that explicitly historians are much more dangerous than the nuclear physicians. But I would say, I would add one more sentence. Memory studies scholars are more dangerous than historians in that sense. So, I mean, this is a really complicated one. But so navigating among the competing memories is really, really difficult. But also, we need to be very much alerted about all the political implications behind very seemingly innocent remarks about the memories or even the goodwill. We should be, you know, doubtful of the goodwill of historians and memory studies scholars. And I should be doubtful of myself.
Thank you.
If I may add a little bit optimism to our discussion for the end, I would like to use a historical example of Polish history of 1970s and 1980s, because we usually think about the Polish opposition and solidarity movement in the context of politics, economy, etc., but also the big clash over memory was also the specific of the time. And we are thinking about the autocracies as very powerful because they control the school system, you know, publishing houses, etc. So they are controlling also the message about the history. They are controlling memory because they are controlling museums. They are building monuments, giving the names to the squares and the streets, etc., etc. And this powerful communist system, which did it for decades, lost in this battle with the, in fact, underground movement, which was able just to print some, in not such big numbers, some leaflets, some booklets, etc. So, and also, especially in Russia, I'm not a specialist in China, but in Russia there are other actors still, not only the state. Yeah? There is a memorial, other groups similar. So what we could count on is that one day they will win the public sympathy. Yeah, because the regime is not only misusing the past, but also openly lying about the past. So let us hope that will be time for victory of truth.
In responding on your question, I think there will be no good response how to challenge the autocracy in dealing with the past. Is your question? I think that in any authoritarian or especially totalitarian country, there is of course no academic autonomy, no independent discourse on history, no civil society, etc. And in this situation, I think that it probably one thing left for such people who are condemned, especially, I mean, for instance, Polish underground in the Second World War or Polish foreign policy before Second World War. There is no other possibility than to promote a defensive, so to say, defensive discourse on the realities, and it must be in function in academic level, on academic level, and also in the politics of memory. There are no country probably in the world today who does not conduct a policy or politics of memory. But in totalitarian use, it is totally different kind of this narrative of this thought, and I have no optimistic response for your very difficult question.
So I'll just say ad vocem. I remember when I went to Belarus in 2007 or 8 with a group of historians, they asked me just one question on the border, whether I have any books that I'm bringing in. That's about being dangerous. Okay.
I just wanted to see if Maria or Kathrin would like to have or both would like to have the final word or to answer these questions.
I can have a try at this, points of interface between academia, public, and policy, and maybe that also links to all the other questions that were there, because I think like the point of interface is that memory is entangled with liberalism, and I think as scholars we should disentangle it from that, or at least try that. I mean, if I hear these discussions, what are good or bad memories? Or, why is remembering necessarily better than forgetting? And I think these are the wrong, this normative side of memory, we should at least critically question. And some scholars have already started that. For instance, there's a good book by Lea David on how the past can't heal us. So they've started to unearth, also these ugly sides of memory and these like more nationalistic sides. And then something else that also might show another one of these paradoxes of the liberal order, that memory and victimhood has become competitive, for claims over who has suffered more, rather than healing these wounds, as we had hoped for. So I think I don't really have, don't really have an answer to this, but I just think we should be careful with this normative side of memory that also has to be critically questioned within liberal countries, and also, for liberal scholars, and also then, what implications that has for the authoritarian regimes, or people with more nationalistic outlooks.
Thank you. Maria?
I'll be very brief because I'm sure everyone already is looking forward to the evening. Just quickly in response to, what can be done then against very blatantly illiberal memory practices and illiberal memory actors, with all due, regard to the fact that, of course, we have to also consider these normative components of, good and bad memories with a critical distance. But I think when it comes to the situations where we really have like society basically effectively shut down, Memorial did good work in Russia, but it has been now completely sort of outlawed in the Russian society. So it can't legally exist. So when we are in such a situation, I think some of the insights I believe that Łukasz Kamiński mentioned about, how does one also as a citizen fight disinformation are actually very important, because I think we are also all mnemonic citizens, and as mnemonic citizens, we do practice memory politics. So I think, one thing that can be done in public spaces is not allowing the peddling of lies about history to become, part of a normalized public discourse, to actually sort of counteract, counter-troll, if you will, on Twitter. And I've seen some of the really eloquent instances of that recently by historians happening, in this space. Also ridicule, use this as a tactic against that type of actions. And of course, also transparency, showing how, showing the minute detail of how the lie is being put together and communicated and conveyed. And last but not least, I think actually lots in terms of encouraging, incentivizing public reflection over, also in very sort of closed and authoritarian and controlled societies, over the difficult moments in the past can be done via art and literature. And I think, when we think of the Russian case, then Svetlana Alexievich's role can't be overestimated, I think. Because she's done more to the probing the experience of the difficult legacies of various wars and catastrophes, and also the Soviet past in general in the sort of post-Soviet psyche, than perhaps any official memory politician has.
Just I add one dimension to Kathrin's suggestion about the problems of entangled memories with liberalism. I think the colonial dimension actually is involved in your criticism or your the saying about the necessity of being disentangled with liberalism. Means that usually for example, Tony Blair in 1990s suggested that multiculturalism in Great Britain was a barrier to prevent genocide in Great Britain. And under this remark, he completely forgot the colonial atrocities that British Empire had done in Africa. Although Britain, yes, was not involved in the Holocaust, but on the other hand, they had the terrible colonial atrocities. Also, when the Genocide Convention was passed in the UN, the first group in the world who responded to the Genocide Convention most actively was African American Communist Group. They wrote a book, We Charge Genocide, and citing Genocide Convention, they tried to criticize American slavery as a part of genocide history. So in this way, I think that our memories of the colonial genocide or colonial atrocities in the global memory space, in a sense, works out for us to be engaged in different sort of justification of one's own establishment. So I think this, in that sense, your suggestion to being entangled with the liberalism in our memory studies is also related with our memories of colonialism.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like to thank all the panelists and okay, Burkhard. No, I would rather finish. Okay, well, yeah. Then, but please, very shortly.
Of course, it's really a hard question how we can react if a state or historians become under the pressure of authoritarian type of memory of history. But I think we can do something practically, at least two things, and we partly did it also in our institution in Germany. I didn't want to highlight this as an example, but just simply to provide scholarships for people who are willing to emigrate, hopefully just for a certain period of time that they can come back, in a foreseeable future, or on the other hand, don't destroy bridges to Russian scholars where, hopefully they can survive, and if they don't go along with state memory, with the state memory of politics, although there might not be outspoken critics, but they are still not Putin protagonists, so that we have really to focus and to distinguish. That I'm a bit worried because of the sanctions. We are obliged to stop all official cooperation projects which are financed by state money. So in Germany, we are obliged to do it, in probably in Poland and all other countries. And so that we are, well, we have this, we are in a different and problematic circle. On the one hand, we should support independent scholars. On the other hand, we are obliged to this kind of sanction policy.
Okay, thank you. There was one more voice, and that'll be really the last one, the lady over there.
Thank you so much. I think that I am like the only one representative of the younger generation. So actually I wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask you, like, when I talk with my German friends and kind of they say, like, we don't have national pride, we feel this kind of guilt that maybe we shouldn't like show off so much with our culture and so abroad, like in the sense of this national culture. When I also was witness of my friends like Brazilian and Portuguese, and they had actually argue over like the gold from like that went to Brazil, to Portugal from Brazil. And also, like, Japanese ask, like, how many times do we have to say sorry to be forgiven? Like, kind of, when is the forgiveness? And I'm wondering in the sense of how to talk about history without this blaming, grief, resentment, especially when it comes to young generation. Like, kind of now there is a lot of talk about colonialism and so, but young generation, we are really not responsible for the choices of our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. How we can talk without these negative emotions that are associated to history, how to manage that in the sense to be open of the dialogue, but without this imposement, this negativeness that is associated to that. I think it was like something that I was really wondering for a long time. Thank you.
Well, these are very important thoughts. I think that might be a good input for our future projects.
I was just wanted to say the same. It's a great topic for the next next conference. Yeah.
Michael Roswell's implicate subject. I would recommend read that book. You can find a solution from your question from his book on implicate subject.
Good recommendation.
Okay, so now I'll hand over to Rafał Rogulski, and then we will try to wrap up the conference very briefly.
Okay. So before, ladies and gentlemen, before the closing remarks, I think it is a proper moment to say some thanks words to some people who spent last 3 days with us. So I mean you, all of you, all our participants, also online participants, and also all speakers. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much for being active and staying until the Friday evening with us. But preparing of such conference is a work of some people, and I would like to thank all of them. It will be 15 names, but it is worth that you hear these names. I will start with Jade, McGlynn, and with Bartosz Dziewanowski-Stefańczyk, who not only prepared the call for papers, but also made, with the help of your answers for the call for papers, very coherent and very interesting program. And thanks to you, the conference was so interesting. But of course, preparing such conference is also work of some other people connected with everything what is connected with organizing of such project. And those were Małgorzata Pakier, the head of our academic department, Gabor Dani, Konrad Bielecki, Karolina Kruźlak, Małgorzata Fezet-Czyżewska, Magdalena Żelazowska, Magdalena Strąg, Antoni Zakrzewski, Antoni Wiśniewski, Urszula Bijoś, Beata Drzazga, Wojciech Pazik, and last but not least, Burkhard Olszowski. To all of you, thank you very much for your work. And what is very important for our institution, for the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity, is the cooperation with other institutions from other countries. And in preparing of this conference, we cooperated with Center for East European and International Studies, and here especially Felix Krawacek, with Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, Seton Hall University, College of Europe Natolin, Oxford School of Global and Area Studies, and Social Faculty of University of Warsaw. This last partner is our long-term partner from the very beginning. Thank you to all of you, and see you next year. And now, closing remarks.
I think everybody's probably getting to the very sleepy side of tired. And so for that reason, we decided, much to everybody's relief, to keep our closing remarks very, very brief. And I would just like to really sum up by saying thank you to all the wonderful speakers, thank you to, of course, the ENRS. Thank you so much to Bartosz for getting me involved. It's really been an honor to be involved and to also to learn more about the work of ENRS, and thank you, of course, to Rafał Rogulski as well. Yeah, just thank you. I mean, there's not much else to add.
Thank you.